Perfect. Well, welcome, Dr. Joan, to the Root of Our Health. It is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking out your time
Oh,
today
my
to speak with
pleasure.
us.
Thanks for
Great.
inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, so am I, because the topics that we are going to be talking about, very, very important, very passionate about it, and I know you are, and I can't wait to dig in. But first I want to know, and of course my audience to know a little bit more about you, your background, and how you became what you're doing today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. I say I started my journey with my maternal grandfather who owned a candy store. He was sugar addicted. And I'm pretty sure that my mother was sugar addicted as well, with devastating consequences. She was a very difficult woman. My father was a very difficult man. I grew up in a very traumatizing household. I recently saw a book that gave me a new framework that I was just raised by some temper tantrum throwing 3-year-olds. They had kind of emotional maturity. So I didn't really get an upbringing. I wasn't nurtured. I wasn't paid attention to. I wasn't made to feel valuable. And and there were processed foods in the house, which, oh my gosh, even I was born in 1951. So even then, the processed food manufacturers were acting like the tobacco industry. So the tobacco industry was able to do these outrageous things like cigarettes are sexy. Like cigarettes are the most disgusting, not sexy thing you can possibly imagine. But these were masters of deceit, masters of delusion, masters of deception. And the processed food industry applied those same techniques, tactics, if you will, to processed foods. So they were able to persuade modern women. My mother had a college degree. She was very intelligent. And they were able to persuade her that cooking was not modern. Using convenience foods was modern. So we had the bowls of sugary breakfast cereal. We had the white bread. We had the processed dairy products. We had the juice. And ironically, we're not allowed to have sodas. Like the sodas were locked up with the liquor. But everything else was there. We weren't allowed to have caffeine. But my mother had caffeine and sugar in her hand all the time. My dad had a drink every night. They both smoked. And there was a dessert made in our house every day. So there I was in this processed food household, dealing with people who were emotionally unstable. My parents could just go from 0 to the belt was out before you had a chance to even know what was going on. Fast forward 30 years, and I have my own 2 babies, and I'm determined they're not going to grow up in that household. But I have these fits of rage where it comes over me. I'm not in control anymore. I can even bifurcate and disassociate from the rage that's coming out of me. Well, I did my best. I did personal therapy. I did women's healing group, and I mean all in. Like paid for all their trainings, went to all their weekends, became a leader, and then I found the 12-step groups, and I've done 4 different 12-step groups. But it wasn't until January of 1996, one of those 12-step groups for terrible personalities, another person in the group said, "Why don't you try Food Addicts in Recovery?" She could hear the sugar driving my rage and the frustration that even though I was working the program all in, writing the questions and going to meetings, I wasn't making any progress. The raging wasn't stopping. She didn't tell me, but I think she knew that the sugar was driving the rage. Well, I was also a yo-yo dieter. By the end of the year, I'd regained the weight, so I got the book. Didn't read the book, just turned to the food plan. I thought, well, this will never work for weight loss because there's too much food on this food plan. And the miracles just started rolling in. It was the release from bloating, from brain fog, from cravings, from fatigue, from allergies, from a lifelong sinus infection. Just one miracle after the other. But at almost to the end of week 3, I'm standing in my kitchen and I think, wow, everybody's been so good lately. I haven't had to yell at anybody. And I got it in that moment. This is about the food. This is not about my family's behavior. So I had started the support meetings. I went to the support group that weekend and I asked, do people become less irritable on this food plan? 20 heads. Yep, they do. So I set off over the next 22 years to find a reliable method to get people off of processed foods. If I could help one parent get control of their behavior and stop abusing their children, I would have felt successful. So I wrote a book, and then I joined the National Speakers Association so I could talk about the book. And then I got a PR person. I almost got on a great big TV show, but they said, like, you don't have a degree in your field. I had a great MBA. I have an MBA from Stanford. I had my undergraduate degree from Oberlin in economics and political science, but now I'm in a food field. Well, I grew up in Cincinnati where Union Institute and University it's a school for new fields. So I said, well, I will go get one of those degrees. And I spent 3 years getting a PhD, and then I spent a couple of years writing papers. And then I had a prepared meal company thinking that if I just gave people clean food and they saw how good they felt, they would just eat that way. Well, it's like saying to an alcoholic, I'm just going to give you this incredible water and you drink that and you'll feel so much better. Your life will come together and you won't even think about alcohol anymore. That was just how naive I was. But in 2014, my dad died and I got a contract from CRC Press to write the textbook for the field. There's only 2 of us who have a degree in addictive nutrition. And he left me enough money that I could spend full time writing the textbook, which I did for the next 3 years. And I learned why nothing else I had tried had worked. And I learned why nothing else anybody else was trying for weight control and eating disorders was not working. Nothing is working. The country is getting fatter and fatter, more and more obese, more and more severely obese. And I also learned from writing the textbook that we are deeply traumatized by having a very severe addiction and not getting treatment for it, and then being surrounded by people who are emotionally unstable from their own addictions. So the evidence today is that over 80% of Americans have a severe addiction, severe. And that is the key to everything, because a severe addiction requires the standard of care, the level of care requires that person to be protected from cues, triggers, stimulation, reminders, signaling. It requires that brain to be protected from provocation, because now an addiction is simply you have hypersensitive reward system, dopamine, serotonin, cannabinoid, opioid. Your own reward brain cells will start pumping out cravings at the slightest provocation, highly sensitive. So to effectuate getting control over your food and your health now, you have to block out all these very carefully crafted stimulations from the addiction neurologists who work for the processed food industry. And so we now have an online community that does that. We broadcast over 15 hours a day, a live Zoom meeting with a live trained host on the screen, lots of different activities. But you can open up a screen and it's Zoom, which means you can do it anywhere. You have an internet connection. You can do it from a mobile device, most importantly, so that anytime you get overstimulated, those neurologists get to you and they overstimulate your brain and you're being overcome by cravings, you can open a screen, get into your group, which is immediately calming. Oh, no, no, no. This is my group. That I do what they do. I like them. I fit in here. I belong here. No, no, no. I would never eat that stuff. Mm-mm. And you it's a mechanical shift. You shift out of your reward center and into your frontal lobe. And that's where you get control. So, yeah, it's a different world today.
Yeah, most definitely. But well, first of all, thank you for sharing your story and how you got to where you are today. It's always our own story that gets us to be more passionate and to live the life that we either don't want or that we learn from our experience. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that what came up in my mind when you were talking about even back in the 50s when they had, cigarettes and, sugars and all of that, there was something, and I don't know if this is very true, but there was something, a post on Facebook. They were articles or newspaper clippings of back in the 50s, I believe 50s or 60s, to where sugar was actually touted as a weight loss product.
Oh my gosh, they're shameless.
So I'm thinking that it's real, but it's the internet, so you never know. But I wouldn't put it past, again, food companies from eons ago to even now today is so much worse. They're to me, they're like drug pushers. They're literally
They're absolute drug dealers.
Yeah.
They are absolute. There is an addiction business model, and I have published on that. I wrote a paper describing it. It has very particular features, and when you see tobacco come into processed foods in the mid-1980s, they take over in 3 short years. They took over Kraft and Nabisco and General Foods, and they are controlling. The tobacco industry is controlling 10% of American spending on food in 3 years. Well, it's because they suddenly, a couple of things changed, and it suddenly became very possible to bring the addiction business model over to processed foods. And they went for it. We have their internal documents detailing how they brought the tobacco addiction model, the nicotine addiction model, right into Kool-Aid for children. So they very deliberately, viciously, consciously addicted children to sugar. And it's a bit of a long story, but the researchers at University of California, San Francisco are coming through millions of internal tobacco documents and putting the story together from their own memos, from their own employees. And I think just where we need to go with this immediately is none of this mess is an individual's fault. Right? It's not your fault. It's not your fault. The weight gain is not your fault. The weight regain is not your fault. The inability to lose weight now is not your fault. The consequences are not your fault. And the inability to stop eating it in spite of knowing about the consequences is also not your fault. These are, you have been given, I mean, here's the evidence suggests that you have been given a severe addiction without your agreement, without your knowledge, and while your government stood by and let it happen. None of this is your fault. And all the treatment, the eating disorder treatment and the weight loss treatment, none of that is appropriate for an addiction. In fact, all of those treatment modalities make processed food addiction worse. It makes the cravings worse. It makes the loss of control over food worse. So if you get one thing out of this talk, please let that burden of guilt. Don't ever let anybody shame you. Don't ever let anybody blame you. Just tell them, I didn't ask to have this addiction. But now also, you can get the treatment that does work.
Right.
You can get addiction recovery treatment, and it's a very focused treatment, and it does work.
Awesome. And we'll definitely dive into what that looks like in just a moment. But I want to kind of reel it back a little bit in terms of just in our government, right? The what we call and I love the acronym because it's just so right on. Standard American diet are really sad because it is truly sad.
Mm.
And to see just recently that they're saying Cheerios and cornflakes is better than having beef and eggs. And so it's kind of mind boggling how I thought that maybe, people like maybe because we're in our space that I don't see, or I think that people are getting it. But then when this happens, then I'm kind of like, it's like, how can we do this? How can we regress instead of progress?
It's because it's just so profitable.
Right. Well, right. And that's the unfortunate thing. But what I want to also talk about is, so we talk about, and you mentioned like addictive like substances. So obviously what they're saying in terms of what I just said, Cheerios and just a bunch of processed crap, as we like to call them. But can you talk about, I don't know if you mentioned this just now, but what happened in 1980s? Like that brought this all into play right now.
Yes, this is fascinating. And I love telling this story because I think out of all the things that we could talk about, this is the one that will relieve people of the guilt. We've been lied to. Oh, this is your fault. You are not trying hard enough. You're too lazy. None of that is true. That is all deception and gaslighting. It's a kind of psychological abuse to tell somebody they're at fault for something when it wasn't their fault. So what happened in the 19th? So let's do the addiction business model. It's the 5 A's. The 5 A's of the addiction business model. 1, lots and lots of advertising so that you're constantly stimulating the addiction. 2, hiding addictive substances in a seemingly innocent product so that the person I didn't know that extra nicotine had been put into cigarettes. So I smoked cigarettes and I became addicted to them. You have to hide the addictive substance. You have to hide from the person that they are being addicted. Nobody would agree to that. So hiding addictive substances in the product, addictive product formulation, advertising, addictive product formulation, making it available everywhere. They're taking out the cigarette vending machines and putting in snack and soda vending machines, and then making it affordable. It has to be cheap enough that the person can use it often enough to establish and maintain the addiction. And then young age. Attack the children. Because if you grow up in an addicted brain, it's much harder to put the addiction into remission. So when tobacco came into processed foods, a couple of key barriers to those 5 A's had fallen. 1, it's got to be affordable. Well, until 1980, the tobacco addiction dealers would have had to depend on their fellow sugar addiction dealers in Florida for a key ingredient, a key addictive ingredient to hide in the product. And they were not going to be tied into their, also exploitive sugar dealers. But in 1980, high fructose corn syrup came on the market. And we have good evidence that high fructose corn syrup goes through the body like corn alcohol. And they said, oh, great. Now we have cheap, very, very cheap, available everywhere, no problem, sweetener. So a key addictive ingredient came on the market. The other thing that happened in the 1980s is that a very corrupt Harvard nutrition researcher got put in charge of the dietary guidelines, the pyramid. And he's on record as taking money from the sugar industry to distort research in favor of sugar. So even at that time, we're pretty sure that sugar caused heart disease and wasn't fat, but he distorted his publications to put the blame on to fat. Okay, so that was Mark Hegstead. We're going to name these people. And that is why you see on the first food pyramid, the bottom row, what you're supposed to eat the most of is all addictive substances. Mm-hmm. It's flour products that contain gluten. Gluten contains a morphine. Our food is meant to be pleasurable. It is meant to stimulate a little pleasurable response in the brain. But when you take that naturally occurring gluteomorphine and you concentrate it into a flour, you make a fine powder out of it, a fine powder like cocaine, then it gets into your system all at once and you actually get a high and a crash. So that's why flour is addictive. And if you tried to chew a non-gluten like oat groat, it would take a long time. You can't get high off of it. So 2 huge pieces of the 5 A's of the addiction business model, boom, boom, the barriers to those 2 pieces came down. You have to have affordability, you have to have advertising. And there's the government advertising these addictive substances. So whoosh, there goes the tobacco industry rushing as fast as they can get into processed foods.
That's crazy. That is crazy.
And today, 1.6 million Americans are dying every year from diet-related diseases.
Yeah.
In the U.S., all of COVID killed 1.1 million people. And we had, just screaming headlines year after year. Yeah. And why aren't the newspapers covering this? Why aren't they not screaming about this? It's because they depend. They depend on pharmaceutical income, advertising income, and processed food advertising income. Their hands are tied. Yeah. But that's why we get these really bizarre things like, oh, just eat blueberries. What?
No, and you brought up right there the COVID, and I'm only bringing that up because that's what just happened, and it was interesting when it happened. I not that I didn't realize that it was going to be a big virus that it is. However, it was the fear, the scare tactic, and that the people with underlying comorbidities were the ones, and then obviously elderly, were the ones that should have been more taken care of. And, it was more or less, again, the fear and the, like everybody, there was nothing about we should be losing weight or, this should be a better alternative. And again, and I know what we're talking about all comes at the end of, it's all about money, right? It's all about the money. Yes. And it's unfortunate that money drives people to kill other people. Literally, it's killing our society.
One of the authors I admire the most is Rob Lustig, because in addition to being an MD, he's also very savvy about business practices and politics. And he says, our government isn't exactly killing us, but it's standing by and letting the corporations kill us.
Right. Yeah. Right. And they're funding.
I don't think COVID would have happened had we not already been deep into the depths of processed food addiction. Like today, actually 2018, so right before COVID hit, Americans were eating 73% of their food in processed foods.
Right.
And processed foods cause inflammation. I mean, if we had been able to stand up and say, stop eating processed foods right now, get treatment, get addiction recovery treatment, get yourself around people who want to do this with you, we would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I mean, that's according to the evidence. And I don't have hard evidence for that. I don't have an intervention study. But when you see how inflammatory these processed foods are, and the virus worked to make it impossible to breathe, it's just, we got to fight. We have to fight for awareness. So Elizabeth, I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And you mentioned inflammation, right? So, I know a lot about inflammation in terms of how it affects our brain and our body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you go into a little bit of a detail of how this can affect, because we're seeing an uptick in even neurological
Oh gosh,
diseases
yes.
in terms. So can you talk a little bit
Yes.
about that for
So
us?
they're just getting all the way down to the basics. Inflammation interferes with, and I think this is a fair word, cripples. Processed foods cripple cell function. And it prevents blood flow from reaching cells. Well, cells depend on blood flow, like we depend on water and food. Cells depend on getting all their nutrients out of the blood flow. So blood flow's got to reach the cell in order for us to be healthy. And processed foods prevent that. They cripple cells by through inflammation. The processed foods require cells to process a lot of sugar and fat. Debris, trash builds up inside the cell. The mitochondria now cannot move around the cell to do their jobs. The poor quality fats, cell membranes are made from fat droplets. The quality of the fat is so bad that cell membranes are what they do two things. They communicate with other cells, and they decide what comes into the cell. So when your membrane's not working, your cell's not working, et cetera, et cetera. There's oxidative stress and so on. And then also you have insulin resistance. The cell, at some point, the insulin receptors are not working on the cell anymore, which means it can't pull glucose in for fuel very well. It's incredible what processed foods do to cell function. So whether it's a brain cell that is now either hyperactivated and putting out too much of a neurotransmitter, or is deprived of blood flow in the case of the frontal lobe, and you've got attention deficit and learning difficulties and memory loss, poor decision making, poor problem solving, poor impulse control, that can be cells that are hypoactive. You can have depression because these processed foods wear out the feel-good pathways in the brain. They're so overstimulating them that eventually they collapse. It's called downregulation. You can have, so the hyperactivity of cells can be ADHD, hyperactivity. It can be bipolar, where you're manic, you're up and then you're way down. The cells are hyperactive and then they're not working. They become lethargic. They're hypoactive. You can go through all the mental illnesses, and a brilliant book that's come out on this is Brain Energy by Chris Ballmer. And he walks through, it's either hyperactivity or hypoactivity in brain cell function. Well, processed foods inflame the brain along with every other cell in the body. And you have these addictive responses where the reward centers are hyperactive. They're pulling the blood flow away from the frontal lobe. You have hyperactive reward centers and hyperactive stress pathway. That's what drugs do. It doesn't make any difference whether it's sugar, gluteomorphine, flour, excessive salt, dairy with casomorphines, excessive fat, caffeine, or food additives. All drugs, or you just go straight into cocaine and heroin. All drugs dysregulate brain function. All drugs promote stress, promote cognitive impairment, All drugs do that, and so processed foods do that too. This wave, this dramatic increase in mental illness, just look at it. Tracks the dramatic increase in the percentage of calories that Americans are consuming in processed foods. And you can see the correlational trends, which is not great evidence, but when you put it together with the it's called biological plausibility, the mechanism for it. And plus, in our recovery community, it's the addiction reset community, we see this stuff go away. This is something I really like talking about now. I have had the community for 5.5 years, and we were focused on building all the capabilities to put a severe addiction into remission reliably and easily, even fun, without taking up your whole life. It doesn't take up a lot of time because you can play it in the background while you're doing other things. And, it saves people money because they're not spending money on the food and the medical consequences and the all different sizes of clothing and the gas to go get this. No. So they're saving money, and it's really an island of sanity. Nice. So I see all these things for these 5.5 years as we're focused on getting the processed foods out and the stress. So stress is also very destructive. I noticed all these other diseases going into remission. The diabetes and the heart disease markers and the irritable bowel and the fatty liver and the fatty pancreas and the skin problems and the fatigue and the depression and the anxiety and the learning disabilities and the attention deficit and the problem solving and the impulse control. Just this whole range, even reproductive issues, the whole range of diseases going into remission. But it wasn't until Rob Lustig brought out Metabolical, his book Metabolical, that I saw why. Why could so many different things get better? That book it has a whole chapter in there, the 8 ways in which processed foods impair cell function. So if your brain cells get better, then all the brain-related, all the neurological things get better. If your gut cells get better, all your digestive issues get better. If your heart cells get better, all your heart, on and on. So it's logical that when you're in a secure community, it's the people around us, as much as we love them, but our brains have an overwhelming desire to fit in. And if you're around people who are sick and eating processed foods, it's this higher level drive to fit in, to belong, to be protected, to be inside a group of people. It will drag you, just like, lemmings over the cliff. It will drag you to eat processed foods and be sick. But if you're around healthy people, then it will just gently and kindly and float you over to do what these people are doing. And then it becomes easy. It's just shocking when you get that drive to fit in on your side instead of the food manufacturer's side. A lot of things become very easy, very doable.
Yeah. And it's like, it is the people that you keep, right? The community that you keep a lot. You'll have, I'm just gonna, lack of a better word, but fat people breed, fat people. Like, you're gonna be in that community, and the same thing with healthy people. Like, you're gonna eat the same, you're gonna talk the same, you're gonna think the same. But it's not, obviously not going to be overnight, but it's just more or less like you are who you keep.
Elizabeth, I'm going to surprise you, I think, because I've been surprised over the years. So, we're on 15 hours a day. It's very easy. Your brain decides who to copy by who you see the most.
Right.
So it's very easy to make healthy people the people you see and hear the most when you come into our community, because we're on 15 hours a day, around the clock with breaks, but we have other things that people can turn to keep up that messaging. Well, I'm going to tell 2 really quick stories.
Yeah.
Well, a person came into our community, the ARC, on a Monday. And Monday night, we're not judgmental. We know it's a severe addiction, lapsing. We treat it kindly. We have a process for becoming stronger from each lapse. But she was in the kitchen. She did well during the day, in the kitchen at night. Oh, that's something for my family. Well, I could eat that. I'm not going to get into trouble. And she does. Same thing Tuesday. But on Wednesday, this is only 3 days. On Wednesday, she looks at it and she says, well, I could eat that, but I don't want to. Key word, I don't want to.
Want to.
So now you have the activation of the part of the brain fitting in with people who don't want to eat that. Another story, this woman, her whole life, every time she went in the kitchen, oh, I want that ooey gooey thing in the refrigerator, but I should have a meal. No, I'll eat that first. No, I'll eat that later. No, I'm not. The battle. Well, on day 5, on Friday, she goes to the kitchen. She says, I want to make a clean meal. And there's no pushback. That is brain management.
Yes.
That's understanding the highest impulse in the brain. The highest impulse in the brain is to fit in.
Awesome. Yeah, those are great 2 stories. That's just it shows it's possible, right? It just shows it's possible for all of us. It's for all of us. I just want to so we're talking about, obviously, most of America is addictive. We're
over 80% severely addicted.
And so how could we start on the recovery path then? What does that look like?
I'm gonna suggest that people learn about the signs. This is a great leap to go from I have a weight problem to what do you mean the tobacco industry gave me severe processed food addiction? But it is the door to freedom. So please go to processedfoodaddiction.com and take the self-quiz. There are 11 criteria for addiction developed by the American Psychiatric Association conscientiously over 50 years. 11 behaviors that indicate an addiction is present. If you have 6 or more of them, then the threshold is that you have a severe addiction. And I've gone through the evidence for, population-wide evidence. 6, so I'm just going to run through the 6 that most people have. Over 80% of people have this. Unintended use. 83% of the country is overweight or obese. They did not intend to get that way. Failure to cut back. We have evidence that virtually 100% of people will regain lost weight within 3 years. Cravings. Cravings correlate with body status, body shape status. Use in spite of knowledge of consequences. 93% of Americans have high triglycerides, cholesterol, blood glucose, blood pressure, or waist to hip ratio. 93%. And that includes children, which means among adults, it's probably closer to 100%. Tolerance. So you're using more over time, tolerance or progression. And we see that on a national basis. The percentage of processed foods being consumed continues to climb every year since tobacco came into processed foods. And then a withdrawal syndrome. And we get this evidence from the keto community. They call it, when they get on a keto food plan and they get the refined carbohydrates out, they call it keto flu, but I know what it is. It's withdrawal. Mm-hmm. So we have epidemics of these withdrawal syndromes, headaches, stomach aches, lethargy, irritability, depression, anxiety. So people are experiencing withdrawal. It's being called something else, and they don't know it, but there are epidemics of that. Okay. So yeah, the research shows over 80% of Americans are suffering from those signs But go to our website, go to processedfoodaddiction.com, take this self-quiz. It's not a diagnosis, but you can track out how many signs of this you're experiencing. And then if you leave us your email address, we will invite you to an educational workshop, and you can start to learn about what to do for yourself. If you just know that this is for you, just go to Food Addiction Reset, sign up, join the Addiction Reset community. Don't wait on the third day. There's no contract. It's $59 a month. You'll save that money over and over. And if you don't like it after 1 month, you just go to the website and pull your own credit card. So, yeah, find out about what is this. This is the thing. The right level of treatment for a severe addiction is residential treatment. We're not sending a couple of 100 million people to residential treatment for a few years, but the next the appropriate level of care for somebody who's been assaulted and given an addiction is intensive outpatient. And we're not sending hundreds of millions of people to hospitals. The programs don't exist anyway. But you can get the equivalent of that online inexpensively. I've spent my every waking hour almost. I'm trying to recover from workaholism. Since January 1997, putting this together. And dang, I looked at, 6,000 studies to write the textbook, 2,000 studies cited in the textbook. I now have over 7,000 studies in my database. The research is all there. The researchers are all over this. They're churning out studies all the time that don't reach the public. So this is a science-based program, meticulously built from one study and another study, and that this shows this, so we'll incorporate it this way. And dang, just don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. There is new treatment out there.
Yeah, thank you. And when they start this, do they get the book that you wrote?
No, you have to go to Amazon to get the textbook.
I mean, I'll put yeah.
The textbook. It's published by a textbook company. It's very readable. In our programming, a couple of times a week, we have readings from the textbook, and people just cry. Yeah, they cry when they see that there is research describing what they've been through, and their practitioner didn't know about it, and nobody in their environment knew about it, but there it is. There's the research. Yeah. The other thing I would like to say is that if you have been given an incurable diagnosis or a chronic diagnosis, you're talking to a professional who's been trained in a very narrow part of recovery. The medical services industry, our quote unquote healthcare industry, is trained in a very narrow range of healing modalities. They've been trained in pharmaceuticals and surgery. And I think it's about 20% of what's available out there, what's been used for thousands of years. But we have a new community. If you're like, I think I could recover from this diabetes or this lower back pain if I just knew what to do, go to remissionoptimistic.com. We've taken everything we've learned about getting people off of processed foods, and then we've added a bunch to it. And we now have a new program, the Remission Optimistic Community. And so don't give, the only thing I would say don't give up.
Right. Right. And that's a great, and thank you for bringing that up, because a lot of people, again, in that situation, they think they have a chronic disease and they think that that's it, that's their life, or everything's too hard. And again, they're deep in that addiction to where
without knowing it.
They're right. And the thing is like, unfortunately, they have tried everything. I mean, not everything, but they have tried because of the diet industry, right? The industry of a quick fix, which that's not where we're going here. Right. You're in the trenches of addiction since for how long? So it's like getting, clean from a drug, from,
Yeah.
and so that expectation of just a quick turnaround is not going to happen. But
No,
what we
I would, I, it, the expectation of a quick turnaround is not going to happen. However, I will say it is astonishing how quickly people get better.
Right. And what I'm saying is, the diet, like, I'm gonna eat,
But
like
quick weight loss is
quick weight
followed
loss.
by quick weight regain.
Right. Exactly. It's not, because
That's
it's exactly
absolutely
that.
true.
Exactly that. So
But
that's where I'm
people
getting
should
at.
know that within 4 days, 4 to 8 days, typically 4 days, could be 8 days, could be 10 days, the cravings will stop.
Right.
If you got a nice clean food plan, the cravings will stop, the bloating will stop, the inflammation will stop, the
Right.
pain will stop, the fatigue will stop, infections will clear up, the allergies will go down, the stomach will stop hurting quickly. I mean, it's amazing when you take the poisons out and you stop that inflammation and you start getting nourishment to your cells. It's astonishing. The hardwiring, the original factory blueprint is still there. I
Yeah.
say to people all the time, if it's not been surgically removed, lost in an accident, or born without it, it'll start to work again.
Oh yeah. The physicalness is like overnight. It's like going to programs like yours, and things like that. That's the mental piece. It's kind of like, when you're smoking, the physical aspect after 24 48 hours, you're back to like clean
Amazing.
air, like amazing. But it's getting over that addiction, the mindset of it. And again, programs like yours and
Yeah.
things like
Yeah. And
that,
I know
that's definitely needed, because that's the
you're
mental
making a
piece of
good point, which is lapsing is part of recovery.
it. Right.
And don't think that if you have a lapse that you have somehow failed. What does take time and what does take really the rest of your life is protecting your brain against stimulation. Your brain is deeply trained to release this flood of cravings, which controls behavior and causes us to reach out even when we don't want to, causes us to put things in our mouth even when our brain is screaming, no, no, no. There are different centers in the brain and they are at war with each other. So just because you lapse does not mean you're a failure, you're lazy, you don't have none of those things. This is the natural progression of recovery from a severe addiction. Just what you do if you have a lapse is increase your protection, increase the amount of time that you're spending around healthy people. It's
Right.
all doable.
Of course. We are resilient people, and
We
our bodies are resilient. Our bodies are made to um, you know, thrive. It's just, we gotta combat the outside forces that are making us sick. But Dr. Joan, I appreciate you being on here.
thanks a
I
lot.
know that you mentioned a few, and I'm going to link everything in the show notes in terms of all the websites that you gave. Even the books that you mentioned too. I'll re-listen and write down all the books that you mentioned as well. Your textbook as well. Everything is going to be linked in the show notes.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, outside of that, is there any other place that people can reach out to you? What's your favorite place
Yeah.
that you go to?
Info at processedfoodaddiction.com. We
Perfect.
monitor that email address carefully. You will get help. Somebody will respond to you. We offer jobs. So for people who take our training, you equipping yourself with the knowledge and the strategies and the tactics for fending off those addiction neurologists at the food industry. We do that. We train people, and then they can get a job with us. We are in the process of creating influencers in specific fields. Like Elizabeth, if you wanted to be an influencer
Yeah.
in the functional medicine coaching field, you can go through our program. Um, my people have created me as an influencer we know how to create influencers. So if you have a certificate, for example, you've been trained in physical therapy, and you want to be an influencer in the physical therapy field, come and take our program. We will help you. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Joan, for again being on here, for all the
Thanks, Elizabeth.
education, wisdom, and just knowing that it's first of all, it's not too late, right? And and don't give up. I think that's the main message: is don't give up.
And it's
We
not your fault.
and it's not your fault.
And that's the other thing. People give up because they've been told they're a failure. You have never failed. You have
Right.
never failed. Those programs that were sold to you were broken before you bought them.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on here. And to everybody else, have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, Elizabeth.